Hello, everyone, and welcome back to the Stay Strong in America podcast. I am your host, Tyron Brown, here for another episode of our Mindful Mondays. And so for our new listeners, I know you may be wondering what that even means. Well, this is our episode segment where we focus on physical, mental, emotional health, and well-being. So if you happen to be driving, I want you to keep your eyes on the road, but your ears wide open. And if you happen to be in a stationary place like a coffee shop, your friend's house, or even better yet, your own place, feel free to take out a notepad and jot down some notes, because today's episode is definitely going to be one for the books. So stay tuned. Okay, guys, so let's cut straight to the chase. Usually I start off my episodes talking about something that inspired me to, discuss a topic that I have in mind. But here we're talking about something very sensitive, to say the least, and I want to prepare you all for this episode. And the reality of it is that a lot of this is starting with me, and I just want to admit something to all my listeners, and that is that I feel like I've been a fraud, and I just want to be honest about that. I feel like I've been a fraud because for a while now I come on here and I tell you stay strong in America. I provide you tips on how to be a better person, how to grow overall, and I assume a lot of you probably have been doing the work, and I thought I was, but I really wasn't. Not to the extent that I needed to. And to be quite honest, I wasn't even aware how much work I needed to do on myself. And that was until, things went, in my stomach. I went through a bit of a struggle, and I really exposed myself, particularly in a relationship that I was in with recently that, ended as it should have, because I didn't do that inner work. And that inner work had a lot to do with my childhood, I believe, and certain, not just trauma, but that's why I call it trauma, trials, and tribulations, because there is a lot to unpack here that I haven't, discussed about myself. And I think a lot of you probably haven't discussed as well either. So today's episode is called What I Really Needed, addressing childhood trauma, trials, and tribulations. And I want to keep it broad like that because what certain people experience, they may not deem as trauma, and so be it. But it may have been a trial for you, and it may have been tribulations for you. So there may have been struggles you encountered in your childhood that are still affect you in your adulthood. And that has happened to me, and I see how that's impacting me today. Now on the surface, which I always tell you, be mindful of, individuals on the surface, because on paper, I have my degree, I got my education, I grew out of a tough environment, but still kept my head on straight. But there was a lot of suffering that was going on in that process, a lot of suffering that a lot of us don't talk about. And one aspect of my life where I struggled a bit was when it came to relationships with people, particularly intimate relationships. So friendships, I got a grasp of it. I could keep friends for 20 years. When it came to work, great being a co-worker. And when it came to even situationships, sometimes I think I was better at that. But when it came to commitment in relationships, I always realized I ran into a bit of a struggle. I was always bumping heads, not just with my partner, but with myself. And I was always confused as to how do I navigate this situation, or this relationship rather. And to be quite honest, I found myself self-sabotaging a lot of good things that came into my life. And when you're doing that, a lot of times you're hurting people in the process, because other people are fully vested and they think you're fully on board. It's no different from someone offering you a job. They give you the perfect salary that you asked for, probably even added on an additional bonus, made some accommodations for you to work hybrid, and all of a sudden you renege on the offer and take something that's completely opposite. And I found myself doing that and wondering, Tyron, what in the world is going on? And I just got tired. I got fed up I got tired of being tired of, my struggles, and I just don't want to be a sob story, but that's what I was creating for myself. And so I just want to make sure I'm leading everyone else here in the right direction so that they can make sure that they're moving in the right path forward. And so the other day, actually, I overheard someone talking about another person, and they made a comment that this person just needs to grow up. And I know that's a very common phrase we hear often, when someone, quote unquote, is acting immature in a given situation. But as someone who desires to be a parent one day, that rhetorical question gave me pause, and I start to really ponder, when do we really grow up? Like literally, When does society expect us to go from being a child to being a mature adult? What is that expectation? How does it look? And more importantly, how are we supposed to get there? And who's going to guide us through that maturation process? It could be very overwhelming for people to go through that, and they need a lot of guidance, but we don't have it. And that is what I want to talk with you all about today. Not simply growing up, but the needs we have as a child that make us the great, productive, and self-assured citizens we want to be, and the gaps that exist in the experience that may hinder us from this intended outcome. Those gaps that include emotional support, physical and mental well-being, which far too often leads to trauma in our childhood. Unfortunately, many people are not aware, such as myself, and therefore do not address childhood trauma, and so those gaps in our development in childhood gets pushed under the rug. Yet that neediness and longing for support still lingers into adulthood, and that's what we call our inner child. And so I want to create a safe space to unpack that inner child so that we can learn to parent that inner child ourselves. One episode of discussion will not resolve childhood trauma, trials, or tribulations, but I hope this can be a start to your journey of acknowledging your experience that occurred during your formative years so that you can understand yourself today and work to create a mature and reassured version of yourself that you can be proud of and exude healthy habits that lead to quality relationship with others. I want that outcome. I'm just going to put out there, I want that outcome, and I struggled to get that. And that's because I was in denial of, my childhood experience and growing up and sweeping underneath the rug for so long. And so that's why I'm still here today. It's no different from those who procrastinate, right? You still didn't do that paper. If you wake up a week later, you still have to write the introduction to that paper and then a body and then a conclusion. And I find myself still on the introduction page to my self-work and parenting my inner child. And that's left me here. It's left me back at square one where I thought I passed this stage. But here at 30 years of age, I realized there's still a lot more work to do. And so just stick around for this episode because we're going to unpack a lot here that I think that you can apply to your life. Okay, so I gave you a bit of context as to, what motivated me to make this episode. I thought it was urgent, and that's me just being selfish, just is what I was personally experiencing in my life. And, the person I was most recently with was just like, she had, called something out about relationships I had with certain people in my life. And she, it's kind of like when somebody tells you something, but you just don't want to believe it. And they're like, no, I noticed something. And it was just so honest and raw. And I started to notice that, like, we all have a story, and we tell ourselves that we're good, we're okay, we're in a place for whatever reason, probably because we got a certain degree, we have a certain job, we move into our own place. But those are very surface level material things, and honestly very tangible. But there's a lot of things going on in our mind, in our soul, and in our bodies, in our emotions that we don't expose to others. And that makes sense. We can be vulnerable with everyone. But underneath that all, especially when you're in an intimate space with someone, they can see that. And if you want to tap into that deeper part of yourself, you have to be honest about where you're at in that part of your life. And I realized when I did some digging, and experience I had with that person, that, wow, like, there's a lot that's going on here that I don't know where some of these emotions are coming from. I am very sensitive with certain things. And I like to think myself as cool, calm, or collected, but that just wasn't the case. Far more emotional than I'd like to admit. And people close to me, they may have said that, but when somebody who's supposed to be on your side points that out, then, I find that a lot of times that happens to be the truth. And then, basically, you could walk away from a situation without kicking and screaming, essentially, right? And making a scene, and I'm like that in many other settings, but I feel like just when it came to with relationships, it's just so, like, it's so intense sometimes. And I'll talk a little bit about that later. And I just didn't know where that intensity was coming from. And then I would just, I'm getting back into my faith, which I'll discuss more of that later too. And I was just asking God, I was just like, hey, Just give me a sign, please. I need a sign as to like where is this stuff coming from, because I was at the point where I didn't even want to know why or the root cause per se, even though I found out some of that through my journaling throughout the process. I just want to just move past that and be over with it. And so I was on YouTube and I came across a couple of YouTube personalities, and something came up, and one thing was um, it was CPTSD, so it's childhood post-traumatic stress disorder. But I don't want to talk about that today, because that's something that's more new in the space of therapy and health professionals. But it's just the topic of childhood trauma and childhood just experiences, rather, because I don't want you guys all to think simply trauma and limit it to that, but just your childhood experience and the way it shapes your thinking. We underestimate that so much. Teachers know that. Like they say, hey, it's their formative years, we got to make sure we get them right. A lot of people know that. Health professionals may know that, but there's quite a bit of us who are in denial about that. And I was one of those people where it's like, it don't matter what I went through, it's where I'm at today. But a lot of where you're at today has to do with where you were at yesterday. And a lot of us are still stuck in yesterday and don't even acknowledge that. We haven't grown past yesterday. And so when I learned about these childhood experience and how it impacts our adulthood, I said, wow. Why didn't I think it was just that simple to understanding that? Like, and everything they talked about in terms of the symptoms that you can have from having a rough childhood experience, everything was just like, wow, I related to it. I've experienced it myself. Obviously at different stages, some I grew out of, some I still struggle with, but I was just like, wow, okay, this is something, there's an answer, basically is what I'm trying to say. There's an answer to all the problems I've been having, because you can't keep having these same problems and then keep having excuses for them, because after a while you come off as manipulative. Not to say that people aren't, but that can be the case. You come off as somebody who's indecisive, a liar. But the things that you may be unsure of yourself and unsure where a lot of these emotions and reactions and actions are coming from. You taking a certain job for a reason. You went to a certain career for a reason. You interact with these people for a reason. You make these decisions every day because a lot of what has happened in your childhood that trained you up to be the person that you are. And it's about time we start acknowledging it. And so while I was looking through all these therapists and health professionals and people who are just well versed on what happens in our childhood and how it impacts our adulthood, one person I came across had made a statement, and she had said, there's two types of people that follow me, and one is probably more successful than the other. There's one who wants to know where the issues stem from, and others who are just more solution oriented and simply care to just rid themselves of those bad habits. And the latter, I think for many years, it was the former that I was stuck on, just finding the root cause of everything. But it was just like, instead of the why, focus on the what. What am I doing and how to stop these? And what can I do just to get better? And in doing the what and being very solution oriented, I was able to clear my mind enough to understand where a lot of these things did stem from eventually. And so that's what I want you all to do today. So a first step to that is, probably finding some of the causes that can lead to us having trials and tribulations and trauma in our childhood. The first thing and most obvious, and like I said, it's a few sensitive topics I'll be discussing today, but I won't go too deep into them, but just go surface level just to make you aware. But if you experience any form of emotional abuse, verbal abuse, sexual abuse, or physical abuse in your household, then more than likely that was a trauma for you. And that probably is something that's still affecting you today if you haven't addressed it and worked on it. And that's not to say if you address it and worked on it, you get completely over it. But I find that a lot of times when we address things, we're in a much, much better space than we would have been if we didn't acknowledge it. And if we just let it sit there. Because it's all within us if we have something that we experienced that's affected us. But if we keep it in us, it's just going to bottle up. And what happens when something bottles up? It boils up and then explodes. And you don't want to do that. And certain things you can't anticipate, but a lot of times we have the ability to take action as adults. But just understanding that if you experience any of that, take that in. Now, I want you all to be careful though, because some of us receive spanking, and then there's a fine line when you cross where you feel like it was physical abuse. But I'm not here to determine that. Everybody has their truth and they know what they experienced. I can't tell you what you experienced. You know that for yourself, and that's your voice, and you have a right to stand on that. Um, you know, when it comes to verbal abuse and emotional abuse, those one could be a bit tricky for others. And I think you should do research and talk to somebody you really trust. But if you experience something, regardless, that you feel affect you as a child, or even to this day, you're interacting with people and you hear like, or with parents particularly, since you more than likely grew up with them, and you're hearing words that trigger you, it's a reason behind it, you know. Or if a parent even yells in a certain tone and you get shaken up to your core, acknowledge that, because that that impacted you in some kind of way. And the one thing I did for so long is I didn't realize how much things it wasn't just denial, but I overlooked. You know, certain words that were said to me, certain energy, and I'm not saying like just a parent thing, just people in general. Like I was somebody that would get shaken up if I got yelled at like by a teacher. You know, it would just scare me, and I just, you know, I would just freeze, and I didn't know like why that was the case. You know, so I still have some work, you know, to do there. I'm in a much better space now. I can handle that, but before, as a child, it used to scare me. And verbally, certain things that were said to you, like, I remember when I was a young child, he used to call me, I was called clumsy by a family member, and it was just a repeated thing. And I know that affected me a little bit. I felt the need to be perfect and not look like a fool. And there's a lot of things that said to you as a child that affect you, comparing siblings to each other, so much things that go on. And a lot of times our caregivers and parents, they underestimate that. But it's time that you acknowledge it, not for them, but for you. And whether they care or not, it doesn't matter. If it affected you, it affected you. And they may never change, but that's part of the inner child that you may have to parent. Next cause is your having gaslighting parents or caregivers. So the thing about that is that imagine you're going through these abuses, and let's say some of it is stemming from your household. Let's say like you experience emotional and verbal abuse from a parent, and they're telling you get over it, or no, this is not what happened. Because that's what gaslighting is essentially denying your experience by basically trying to tell you like you didn't experience what you just experienced, and trying to downplay it essentially, and misleading you about your emotions. And your parents may be in denial for it because it may cause them some guilt, right? Like, oh, I didn't talk to you like that. Oh, this spanking wasn't that bad. But for you, it was. And as a child, you may have accepted that, but as an adult, you have all right. And I'm not telling you what to do, but I'm just reminding you of your power, that you have the right to feel how you feel. And you feeling impacted, that takes precedence regardless of what your parents said you should have felt. Because nobody should tell you how you should feel when you experience something, especially if you're on the receiving end of something. Like, it's that's not right. And I think that's where it needs to, that's another cause of, you know, the trauma that we do incur and the trials and tribulations we go through as children, because we experience some form of abuse, but then it gets denied by our caregivers, so we don't even know what to believe. And then we wonder why we're confused about when we experience things when we get older. So just be mindful of that. And it just also parents just sometimes may not have given you that support either too. So we call them caregivers and parents, but I remember one person I knew in the past, actually dated, and she had said that, like, you know, my parents were expecting me to be okay without showing me the way. And I'm like, oh, that, you know, that's interesting. Because there are parents who just like, they expect you to they provide you the basics. Oh, I gave you food, I gave you shelter, and I make sure you got to school safe, and that's all you need. And not realizing there's a lot in between with all that, a lot of emotional support that people do not get. Now, this is not a bash the parent segment, but the reality is that every parent or caregiver has a skewed perspective on fulfilling their child's needs that may or may not be enough for that child. Only you know what you really needed. And sometimes it may not have been in the moment you couldn't put them into words, but definitely in hindsight, we probably all know what we needed. And no parent is perfect, but it doesn't take away from the fact that you had some unmet needs. You know, like that lack of awareness isn't usually intentional, but it's a reality that had an impact on us all. I come from a Caribbean household, and it's funny enough, because my parents are Jamaican, and I grew up with just my mom, and this is a guy on Instagram. His name is Dale, and he makes fun of like Caribbean parents, particularly the moms, right? And I'm assuming he grew up with just his mom as well too. And I remember there was one segment where he was relaxing in the room, just laying down, and she's telling him to get up, do something around the house, because you just can't just lay here in the house doing nothing. Now, that's really funny, right? And we all can relate to. And then I went to the comment section, and the comment section said, "Oh, I guess we all had the same mom. I'm convinced." And it was funny because I was thinking the same thing. Like my mom acted the same way, but and like I said, it's nothing against the parents. A lot of times they're doing what they were taught, right? What they got accustomed to. But that's also telling the child that you can't just relax. You can't just be. You can't just lay down. And sometimes, like, and I'll talk more about this a bit later, like always being on the go. I realized that sometimes I would walk fast. Like I was always on a mission. It didn't matter where I was going. I could be going on vacation. I'm walking fast. I'm going to church. I'm walking fast. And guess what? I'm already an hour ahead, but I had to walk to my high school, and we had to wake up very early, reach there on time. So, and it was also that sense of urgency of like, you got to get up, you got to be ready. I was, raised that way, which is very good too. You get to work on time, or at least you should be if you were, raised that way. But it's also can be stemming from a bit of fear that you're going to miss out on something. And also you don't know how to relax. Like on my days off, I don't know how to relax. I'll be honest. Like I struggle with that. Like I have to go and do something, or else I feel like I'm going to fall behind. And it's like, that may have made sense in a structured setting, in a school setting where like you probably didn't get to a field trip on time, or you didn't get to a track meet or a basketball game on time, or didn't get to turn this assignment on time. But in the real world, like when you're out there, you're working, you're not in these controlled environments. A lot of times people aren't even expecting you to be someplace outside of your job, and your certain obligations. And I have no children, and I'm not married. And even when I was in a relationship, that person was expecting me to be somewhere at a particular time. And it was just, I created that urgency for myself. But a lot of that stemmed from what was occurring in my childhood. And so a lot of us have these cultural traditions of our parents acting and moving a certain way, and we normalize that. And that's where I think a lot of the inner child is formed, is that we normalize things that probably shouldn't be normalized, or that we should at least question. Right? It's good to have certain customs that train you a certain way, but we have to also see if we're overwhelming ourselves, or if we personally were overwhelmed, regardless of what our culture is. And I talk more a bit about that in a bit, but like we have to be honest about our experience. So just keep that in mind, and we'll talk about a bit more about that later. There's three more things. Social environment, such as your school setting, which can include things like bullying, your first relationships, and also where your self-esteem could be wrapped up at that age, right? You're growing. There's growing pains happen in middle school. My high school had a 37% graduation rate. They did a documentary on it. My middle school, I remember, there was a stabbing that occurred. I remember the gang fights that happened. I remember that was the first fight I got in was in middle school. I used to remember the violence, and I remember always being on edge. And anything could happen any one of those days. And it was just, getting clowned at, clowning people back, defending yourself, not knowing, what it's just so much. It's chaos, right? And I used to pump my chest when I graduated from my school district, like, yeah, I grew up in this environment, look where I'm at. But as I've gotten older, my mindset has completely changed, and I do understand why parents want their children to grow up in a certain environment, because I don't think we should really celebrate. Yes, celebrate becoming victorious and overcoming certain obstacles, but don't feel like that should have been an experience that you went through either. And I'm looking back on that and I'm saying, like, man, like, that whole nuclear family, 2-parent household, um, and being raised a certain way in a safe environment. Yes, it may not have taught you as much lessons, but not every life doesn't always have to be a lesson. Life is something that's meant to be experienced, yes, but it's also something that we should live within certain boundaries, right? We don't want to create an environment that causes us to have to watch our back every day, because that's the environment that I grew up in the town I grew up in, where it was good, productive people, but there's also danger out there. It's also certain, and it's not, I won't even point at one particular person to say that they're the problem. There's a lot of systemic issues that occur why people operate like that way in an environment where the median household income is significantly less than in neighboring towns and cities, where the resources there aren't as available as others. And there's good-hearted, down-to-earth people there, and I will always represent where I grew up. Shout out to Hempstead, by the way. But I also know that growing up in that environment, that kind of, it exposed me to the world, but it also was a bit gritty and it was a bit much at times. And sometimes, when you feel like you have to watch out in terms of not just your physical safety, but just protecting yourself, because you're going through your own issues in the house, and then you go into an environment and you have to deal with that and other chaos. It's just chaos on top of chaos, and it just could be overwhelming. And so and even if you didn't grow up in that environment, there's a lot of first things that happen when you went through school as a child. So your social environment has an impact on you. Your community does. And then there's traumatic events such as like a death, for example, death in the family or death of a friend, that can really impact people. Certain people grow up around that, and that changes them a lot. And then finally, there's also being forced, and this is a big one, being forced to mature sooner than peers. That, man, that one is tough, because a lot of this is, it could be caused, like, for example, by poverty, lack of caregivers who do not give attention to you as a child, and other unmet needs that force independence earlier than you were prepared for. Including like a lack of supervision, for example. Like, I know certain people who've told me, like, they had to walk to school as a child. I'm like, so did I. Like, when I was in high school and middle school, they're like, no, I was walking to class in first grade. I'm like, what? What you mean you were walking to class in first grade? I'm like, I'm thinking you could have got, God forbid, kidnapped. Something could have happened to you. But that was their experience. And you may not look at that saying, like, that's, traumatic, but it could be for a lot of people. And more importantly, that can be, you could feel uncovered. You're supposed to feel covered and protected, and you got that guidance. I don't think any child at that age would want to walk to school alone. You're like about 6 or 7 years of age. So that's just something to actually between 5 and 7, depending on when you were born. But that's a bit, not safe. I don't think very responsible. And depending how far you have to walk. But this person was telling me, like, it was a bit of a distance, and the supervision definitely was standard amongst most parents. So, you probably feel left out of that experience. The kids getting to walk to school or dropped off by school by their parents or a responsible caregiver, and that's not the case for you. And also growing up in, like it, when you grow up sooner than you have to, like, you're left with a lot of responsibilities as like a 10-year-old, and you start cooking and everything and have excessive chores or working on a car and supporting the household and making sure things are clean and picking kids up. A lot of children get parentified at a very young age. You probably think like 13, 14. No, it starts happening at 8 for some kids, and other cases even younger. So a lot of it could stem from there. So just give yourself some grace, first of all. But also, I want you to first start acknowledging, any kind of emotional, verbal, sexual, physical abuse you probably experienced, any gaslighting you experience from parents or caregivers. Your social environment and what that did to you and how you operate in your relationships you form, any traumatic events, and being parentified as a child and having to grow up so quickly. Consider all that, and I think you may unpack a little bit more about yourself in terms of any trials and tribulations or trauma you had as a child. All right, so what are some indicators that you probably have some childhood trauma, trials, or tribulations that you have to unpack? The first thing that I heard very frequently when I looked this stuff up was emotional regulation. The ability to just regulate your emotions on your own, not depend on someone else, which is something that, a lot of people that experience childhood trauma might do, but just on your own, can you emotionally regulate? And I just want to say that there's different levels to this, all right? Like me, I'm somebody like, if you meet me, like people says you're very sociable, cool, calm, collected, which I am, meeting most people. But I know certain situations kind of get me upped and amped, like when certain things happen, like if there's a fire, I have to put it out right then and there, if I get like, for example, there was one time I got a letter in the mail because I had got stopped for, driving, obstruction of driving, something. I don't even know what it was called, but I basically was driving in a lane I wasn't supposed to. Cops, pulled me over. I was like, what's going on? He said, oh, that's what you did. And I had to go to court. I had to set a court date for that one. And I got something in the mail from all these lawyers. And it's like, you can have points in your license. And it's just like, oh my goodness, my heart starts pounding. I'm like, what's going to happen? And I looked it up and I talked to, I think, my sister about it. She's like, oh yeah, you just do X, Y, and Z. But I noticed that's how I get when certain situations like that occur. But over time, I've known how to like, okay, Tyron, everything is not a fire. You don't have to put everything out. Me hearing the word urgent, sometimes I'm very reactive. Like, oh, this is a big deal. So if like a colleague may say, this is urgent, so we have to get this done. I'm like somebody who's like, all right, ready to go. But it's like, okay, it's really not that big of a deal. You could chill. And emotional regulation can start like that, but it could get a lot more severe. And I'll give an example of myself before I discuss anyone else. So I'll talk about me, right? Emotional regulation, intense emotions, hypersensitivity, and no chill sometimes. And I know that sometimes, like when I get in like relationships, and I'll discuss that in a second, that like, it could, and it's something that I didn't know that was going on until I get in it. It could be like, oh, hey, not even we need to talk, but like someone's upset, like my partner, she may be upset. And it's like, okay, I'm leaving for today. My head starts going in 20 different directions. She's going to break up with me. This is going to happen, X, Y, and Z. And I'm like, and nobody knows this is going on. Like I'm cool, calm, and collected on the outside, but on the inside, oh my goodness, the levels are going up and down. And I'm just overthinking. And then it's like, sometimes I can't even get myself to get that place of like reassurance. It's like, unless I probably go to the gym, work out, or some kind of distraction, but my mind is pondering, and it's like, one probably the most recent person I was with, she gave me feedback like, just because we have a disagreement, it doesn't mean I'm gonna break up with you, or it doesn't mean that we have serious problems. I just had an opinion, and I try to point the finger and say, oh no, it's because you're moving this way and you react this way, that's why I'm getting nervous. But it's like, chill, bro. Like really, like it's really not that big of a deal. You can relax. Like, don't have to take things. Basically, like when you experience, certain things in your childhood, you try to anticipate your caregiver and the parent in terms of what they're thinking and how they're going to react, because sometimes a reaction did happen, and it doesn't necessarily mean it's a violent reaction, but it could also be retribution, or retaliation. And also in other environments, not just in your household, like. I know certain people in school where like, grow up in an environment that I did where something happened one day and this person wants to fight you the next day. So my mind was, I had to anticipate everything. And so that anticipation of and overthinking, it stems from stuff like that. Those experiences that you just became so accustomed to. And so, like someone who may have issues with emotional regulation at times, or have intense emotions, even if they don't show it, They're also somebody who people may say, oh, you're very emotionally intelligent and very aware because you're aware of this person's emotion. But it's almost like you're too aware. You're too aware. Like, it's like you're watching everybody's move. Not like a creep, but just like you're just very aware. And it's because you might be fearful of a certain reaction or retaliation that's coming later. And I noticed that about me. I was like, oh, wow, I thought this was a skill set, which can be for in some cases. It's also something that can work against me, right? Like, you rely on your intuition for certain things, but there's a point where it's not just your intuition, it's just your mind churning, trying to anticipate things. And it's like, you can't predict the future. You cannot. So you might as well just leave it for what it is and just keep going. And certain people, such as myself at certain times in certain situations, have issues with that. And I had to do some work to find out like where that came from. And when I was journaling, I was finding out like, wow, I had this certain reaction because of certain things that did occur in my childhood. And I think it was more so a lot was in a social setting, an environment that I grew up in. And it was like I had to be that hyper aware. And you having to be hyper aware means you're going to be hypersensitive and your emotions are going to be based on your environment. My friend even gave me the feedback. He said, yo, Tyron, I noticed that you pick up people's emotions very easily, like, and it's just like, that's not necessarily a good thing. You don't want to take on somebody else's emotions. You can know it, but don't try to figure it out. I actually worked with somebody. I was working in as managing certain people at one point, back when I used to work in education. And one person I worked with, I remember just her just being very hypersensitive. Oh my God. It was like if I changed an activity for the day, it would throw her off. And I used to remember her just like, basically I had to start like doing things and being mindful that this person may react a certain way. And I think we both had a bit of the same struggle, except I found hers to be far more intense. Because as a manager of people, you shouldn't be wrapped up in what or somebody else's and an employee is going to think of you all the time. Like you're managing them. You can't always make decisions based on their emotions. It just doesn't. Life just doesn't work that way. But me, I just knew how this person was going to react, and I said, okay, it is what it is. I have to just be okay with how she's going to react, right? And but it was just getting too much one day. I just couldn't take it anymore, and I said, let me just tackle this head on. And I asked her, I was like, hey, can you just tell me just a bit about you and your background? I just feel like there's things going on that I don't know. And when she unpacked, her childhood, it made sense. And I won't go into it for the sake of their privacy and everything, but it was just like, oh, I understand. So I like to have that awareness. That way I could work with them. And also make that person aware that like, okay, I can't do things just based on your emotions. And I want them to know that. And I want you all to know that too. You have to regulate your own emotions. The world can't change to fit your emotional needs. It just can't be the case. And you can't do things on behalf of other people's emotions to make sure that you're okay. You have to deal with emotions on your own, and you have to work on that yourself. And when you don't do that and you're intense, what happens is that you're very reactive and you make decisions that you may regret later. And so, but me just having that conversation with that individual, it just helped me just be able to navigate that situation. And I'm not saying every manager is going to do that for you, and I'm not saying you have to do that for everyone you're going to manage. But that's just an example to show the importance of emotional regulation and how you can know that's lacking sometimes. The next thing is not setting boundaries and not respecting them. I was proud of myself today because, I was actually talking with my sister, and she actually going to be an episode as a guest on my next podcast episode that's going to be tied to this topic. She's a social worker, and I had asked her, hey, do you want to come join in for the session? And I gave her some options, but I noticed the fact that she said, hey, she's a bit tired and she just came from work and she has some things going on. And this is like the first time in a while I've said to someone, hey, if you're going to be busy, right, or you're going to be tired, let's just do it another day. And I gave that person an option, and she said, yes, please. And not only was I asking for something at the last minute, but that person was also tired. Now, imagine, typically I would just go ahead and just think I was doing a good thing by motivating them to come in. But it's also like, bro, respect people's boundaries. And that's something I started to do more. And I noticed that the reason why I wasn't respecting people's boundaries was because I didn't respect my own. I didn't have none. And even if I did, I didn't enforce them. And that's what happens sometimes in your childhood. Sometimes people didn't respect your boundaries. And that can mean several things. I mean, we talked about the different kinds of abuses, right? And so that can look very ugly for us as children. Like, what did that mean when somebody crossed our boundaries and made us uncomfortable? Or you just get used to somebody coming in and just disrupting your environment, right? You might be at a place of peace. And funny enough, someone shared a story on Instagram today where they were talking about things we do as parents to children that we wouldn't appreciate as adults. Like coming in, turn off taking the remote out their hand and turn off the TV. Like that is like, and certain people may be like, well, I'm the parent in the household, but it's like, how are you raising up that child? You know, you're raising them up to think that that's okay, because that's not the case. You know, you may not be doing anything wrong, and then like there are some times where if you just breathe the wrong way, they're like, because you had a stressful day, a parent may take offense to that. Like, what are you huffing and puffing it for? And it's like, can I catch your breath? And I noticed that sometimes like a lot of the boundaries we needed as children was just grace for our emotions. You need to give children that. And if you don't, then you build it in and you push it underneath the rug. So you could have felt tired, but whether you were tired or not, it didn't matter. Your boundary of like, I'm tired, I want to go to sleep, I have things to do the next day, it didn't matter, because whatever the demand was from that parent or that caregiver or for some other authority figure. And so I became so accustomed to that, going above and beyond. And I would get hurt with people who enforced them. You know, recently I got into it with a good friend of mine over spending money, but I said to myself, and I said to that person too after the fact, like, you know what? It's because I'm so used to breaking my boundaries when it comes to spending money with that person that when they enforce it, it gets me upset because I expect them to do the same thing for me. But whose fault is that? Theirs or mine? It's mine. And that's what I want you to do. Start recognizing these indicators of childhood traumas, trials, and tribulations, but also take accountability to see that sometimes it is you. Doesn't mean it started with you, but it is you that can be the issue, right? The next thing, a harsh inner critic. Guys, okay, I can just, it's just, I can talk about myself here. Shame, guilt, perfectionism that turns into projection. That is me a lot of times. So I could take feedback definitely now, but you know, in certain spaces, like let's say in the confines of a relationship, not work, because work I can say, oh, that's work, you know, but in a relationship, for example, or sometimes even at work, when someone's criticizing me, it probably, or giving me feedback, it sounds like a criticism automatically. And that's because what's going on in my mind and in my soul and my heart and everything, I'm already criticizing myself a lot of times. Like, I got to do better. I got to be better. And my sister recently gave me feedback, and so did my godmother. My godmother's in her 80s now, and she knew me when I was a baby. And she said, honey, like she said this over the years. I can remember as a teenager, she said this, honey, I think you're a bit hard on yourself. You've always been so hard on yourself. And my sister said, Taron, you need to stop being so hard on yourself. And I just didn't know why I felt like I had to be so hard on myself. And I'm still unpacking where that has stemmed from. But I think a lot of this harsh critic, you know, that is going to be related to something I'm going to discuss in a bit. But it's like you feel like you have to prove yourself for worthiness of you know, probably someone's love, probably as a parent's love, or maybe that's when you were most celebrated. I remember I did speeches as a child, oratorical contest they called it, Dr. Martin Luther King speeches, and I was very good at it. I was known in school for doing it. That's where I probably have this voice here today to speak with you guys. And I remember my mom would come there to celebrate us getting awards, me and my siblings. And I think a lot of my, and that's why I say sometimes it's not trauma, it's just like your experience as a child. But a lot of my identity was wrapped up in me performing and me being celebrated in that way. Like I always had to be on stage and be noticed. And maybe that's where my call for attention comes in and everything. And I didn't realize that, like, there was a lot of times where I just wanted to be out there, out in front of people, and I liked it. But there was some time where I had to sit back and I was like, Tyron, like, this behavior isn't good. Especially when you start reading self-help books and how to be better, how to grow. And it was almost like that inner child in me. Like, I was like a little kid. I always wanted to be on stage and be performing. And it was like, fall back. Like, you don't have to be always out there and about. And you don't have to be perfect. Like, nobody's expecting you to perform and be the best of the best. And I think there's a lot of shame and guilt that we have in ourselves and being tough on ourselves because we felt like we had to perform for the love of others. And that's why I talk about just being. We just have to be ourselves and just let life flow. The next thing is self-validation struggles. That is a big one. I think everybody struggles with that. But when you're unsure of yourself, and yeah, sure, it's great to have mentors. I think it's very important, not 1,000 of them, but probably anywhere from, 3 to 5 solid mentors that you look up to who are in a place where you want to be and who gives you sound, mature advice. But when you have to just like search for others to validate your opinions, like, it's like you don't believe what you say, or what you're thinking. And one therapist, he talked about it online. And he said, like, there was like, he worked at a restaurant and everyone had a great experience with this person. And he felt like this person was kind of fake. And it was almost like he couldn't believe himself until somebody else confirmed his opinion. He didn't know that it was okay for him to have a difference of opinion with others. And one person had said to me one day too, she was like, person I dated, she said, I'm okay with having my own opinion and others not believing, what I believe. I could stand on it. And I said, yeah, I'm the same way too. I lied. That wasn't the case. Some cases that is the case with me, but there was quite a few times I vividly remember, like, I had my truth, and my truth wasn't the truth unless somebody else said it was. And that's when I had to like over explain, and the thing is, we probably struggle with that because we probably had gaslighting authority figures in our lives who made us feel like whatever we were experiencing was a lie. And sometimes it may not have been parents. It could be like your siblings, or it could be friends who you chose as friends. And it's like, you try to tell, it's like you being vulnerable to a friend, telling them you experienced something traumatic, and they're like, nah, that wasn't the case. And that was your closest friend. And because they didn't validate it, you didn't believe it. But that's why I say you have to start acknowledging your truth, because you know what you experienced. And if you're a fair person, or you feel like you're a fair person, then you don't necessarily need somebody else's validation. Your inner thoughts, your feelings, that's what they are. There for you, and that could lead into a lot of other things, right? Because what happens is that instead of caring and focusing about what you feel and what you think, you're obsessed with what others think, and it rolls into this thing where you're comparing yourself to others, which is another thing. Like, you're comparing your lives to the lives of others, which makes you lack authenticity after a while, right? And the world passes you by because you're standing on the outside looking in, and it's like you're not even moving about in the world. And I know that happened with me a bit. Like, there was a time where, like, I was on social media, and I went through a process of like going on LinkedIn and looking at people's achievements and looking at their timelines of where they hit certain things in their career and the dates they got it at, and estimating the age based on the time they graduated college. Like, I'm supposed to be here. And I remember I looked at one person's profile and I said, wow, man, this is very, very influential. And I remember I was next to somebody who was like, I believe, academic advisor at my school. And she said, that's great, ain't it? But she said to me also, don't be influenced, be inspired. And that struck a chord with me because, what she basically was saying was that, like, if you're influenced, you're going to want to do what that person is doing. But if you're inspired, you can take their story and find motivation within it and apply it to your own story that you want for yourself. And I struggled with that for a while. And it's not until I guess I hit this age of 30 where I'm like, oh my God, I'm not going to get any younger. I'm only getting older. But only recently did I become more comfortable with my journey. For a long time, I can tell you, I was just following whoever journey seemed like it looked good on paper or on social media, you know. And I'm aligning myself with others. I'm looking at their milestones of like relationships, marriage, engagements, vacations, buying property, children, anything that was a milestone. Okay, I want to opening up a business, you know, reaching this point in their career. I want to be associated with something like that. I wanted my story to be somebody else's story, and that's a problem. And you may not think that that's stemming from your childhood, but like when you're a child, like you're supposed to get that self-assurance that you're okay on your own, just being and living your own life. And it could look very envious, and that's why it's like we don't resolve childhood trauma and your childhood experiences and really look into them and the trials and tribulations you encounter. People may interpret you as like, oh, you're an envious person, but it's like you might be an ambitious person, but an ambitious person who just didn't get comfortable being in their own lane. And I know that's something I struggled with for a while, but now I'm fine being where I'm at, going at the pace that I'm going at. And it's still a work in progress, but I say, you know, sometimes look at friends who are just comfortable being themselves. They don't have to be the most fit person. They don't care about being the fastest, the smartest, the most successful, most financially well off. They're just, you know, doing what they have to do for themselves. And you know, so that's something that's very important. And so the next indicator of some of your childhood experiences, traumas, and tribulations is a thing called limerence in fantasy land. Oh my goodness. So now think about how this all spills into relationships. When I found out about this made sense because this is where most of my struggle existed. And that's simply you just going to level 10 in terms of like when it comes to like romantic love. And I just remember that like I remember I had made a collage with somebody back in the day. I won't say when, but my best friend, he knows that, one of my good friends. And I remember I showed it to him and he started to laugh and he said, "Tyron, you look crazy." And I think he was right to say the least. And the thing about it is that like a lot of it may seem nice and romantic, and also it could seem like you may be a person who's like crazy where like, you know, you're all about love, and then all of a sudden all your emotions show up and the emotional dysregulation shows up, and you could look like a crazy, even narcissistic person, right? But, you know, when they explained it, and I listened to the different health professionals talk about limerence and in the aspect of obsession with love and romantic love, they talk a lot about how a lot of us, you know, we probably wanted and needed that, and maybe you didn't get it from a parent, and so or somebody who you really trusted and expected that from. And if nobody else filled that role, like I remember my sister saying to me, did somebody else fill that role of like certain affection and things of that nature, outside of just, you know, our mom? And I was like, yeah, our godmother did, you know, like my godmother did, because she has a different god. Her godparent did that for her, but you know, because my mom, lovely person, but that affection was more so when I was like elementary school and younger. But as I got older, she was just the enforcer. She was playing dad because, you know, as a single parent. But that's what I really wanted, and I lacked, and so I put that on to relationships. And so I would go from like just daydreaming about somebody, having a crush, to all of a sudden thinking about marriage. And it's like, slow your roll, buddy. It's not that big of a deal. And so just I want you to start thinking about why that happens. And if you're in relationships, why does it have to be so intense and so serious? And that's something that I struggle with. And, you know, and I can say on this episode, I apologize to anyone I've dated in the past, because I was asking for too much. I recognize I was asking for them to fulfill some unmet needs, to mother me in certain ways, and to provide me affection and self-love that I need to do for myself. And so it put a lot of pressure on the relationship. And even one person called me out and said, you're not a kid. I'm not your parent. And others even thought that, you know, maybe, you know, like, I can't do enough, but they were doing more than enough. They gave me more than validation, but the validation I needed was the self-validation, that self-love, and that self-assurance, and assurance I should have probably gotten as a child. And just me not acknowledging the lack of that made me pull it into that relationship and cause things to flare up and completely end. So I'm going to hold off right there because, we talked a lot today about unpacking this childhood trauma. We talked about, relationships with caregivers to relationships with people we're in relationships with today as adults and parenting that inner child. And so I just want to give you a few of the causes and indicators of, childhood trauma and trials and tribulations and unmet needs that occur during these experiences and how they impact us as adults. So this is going to be a 2-part episode. And so this is just part 1. In part 2, I'll be having my sister on, who's a licensed social worker, and she'll be giving us some helpful tips and solutions for us to get started with parenting that inner child and how we can look forward to a more positive experience and livelihood. So thank you for tuning into today's episode. And as usual, with much love, stay strong in America.